Real Clear Politics, the New York Times, the Washington Post, conservative outlets across the board from Fox News to National Review, they've got the data. Turnout by Republicans was great. They just didn't vote Republican. It suggests candidate quality actually was a factor. This is how the New York Times begins this story on the data. After yet another disappointing showing for Republicans in Georgia's Senate runoff on Tuesday, some conservatives like Sean Hannity, Newt Gingrich, and Kevin McCarthy have begun to point to a surprising culprit, a failure to take advantage of early voting. The theory seems to be that Republicans are losing because early voting gives Democrats a turnout edge. It follows a similar conversation after the midterm elections when a chorus of conservatives said Republicans needed to start encouraging mail voting. I mean, I would like mail voting in this country, but not the way they mean it. Kidding, ladies, kidding. In state after state, the final turnout data shows registered Republicans turned out at a higher rate, and in some places a much higher rate than registered Democrats, including in many states where Republicans were dealt some of their most embarrassing losses. Instead, high-profile Republicans like Herschel Walker or Blake Masters lost because Republican-leaning voters cast ballots for Democrats, even as they voted for Republican candidates for the U.S. House or other down-ballot races in those states. Georgia is a fine example. While Mr. Walker may blame turnout for his poor showing in November and earlier this week, other Republican candidates had no problem at all. Brian Kemp won by nearly 8 digits over Stacey Abrams. Republican candidates for House won the most votes on the same day. Yet Senator Raphael Warnock won in Georgia anyway because a large group of voters willing to back other Republicans was not willing to back Mr. Walker. We went back and looked at respondents to our pre-election Time Siena survey and matched those to post-election vote turnout records. We found the respondents who said they backed Mr. Walker were actually likelier to vote than those who said they backed Mr. Warnock, but Walker still lost, and lost again on Tuesday by 3 points, 2 points worse than in November. Okay, let me break this down for you. We have real-world data now. We are not talking about surveys. We are not talking about polling. We are talking about who actually voted. How do we know who actually voted? Well, we can take the list of people who vote regularly in Republican primaries. And if you vote regularly in Republican primaries, we can presume you are a Republican. In the same way, if you vote regularly in a Democratic primary, we can presume you are a Democrat. So we can take the voter survey files and see how many of these Republicans who vote in Republican primaries voted in the general election, and how many of the Democrats who vote in Democratic primaries voted in the general election. And guess what? More Republicans voted than Democrats. But those Republicans clearly voted Democrat in some key races. In Maricopa County, Arizona, home to Phoenix and 70% of the state's voters, Republicans turned out 75% compared to 69% of Democrats. Republicans outnumbered Democrats by 9 percentage points. And Blake Masters and Kari Lake both lost Maricopa County. Here's the thing, for those saying, well, clearly this was voter fraud with all the irregularity problems in Maricopa County. Other Republicans statewide won, including school superintendent. In Clark County, Nevada, 67% of Republicans voted compared with 57% of Democrats. Republicans outnumbered Democrats statewide, yet Catherine Cortez Masto prevailed over Adam Laxalt, who is a good dude. For those of you who say, well, clearly it was stolen and it was voter fraud, Joe Lombardo, the governor there, governor-elect, is a Republican backed by Donald Trump, and he won. In Georgia, Republicans turned out at a higher rate than Democrats, and every statewide Republican won. Republicans got more votes when you add up all the congressional races. More Republicans voted than Democrats. Add up all the state house races, all the Republicans got more. State Senate, same thing. Only Herschel Walker lost. In Pennsylvania, Republicans got more of the total state share of votes cast for Congress than Democrats, and yet lost the governor's race and lost the Senate race. I need you to think about that one, because some of you will say, well, gerrymandering. Well, yes, but it balances out in the end, because you take all the people who voted in all of these areas of the state and add them together for a statewide vote count. And in the statewide vote count, the Democrats got more votes for their gubernatorial nominee and more votes for their Senate nominee, but the Republicans got more votes across the state for the House of Representatives. In North Carolina, Ted Budd won. Ted Budd is a good dude. He's a friend. But he was heavily tied to Donald Trump in North Carolina. And Ted Budd barely won. And Republicans in North Carolina had a massive blowout. I mean, they got a supermajority in their state Senate, came within a seat of one in the House. They took back the state Supreme Court. Republicans in North Carolina ran everywhere except for two of them, Bo Hines and one other whose name escapes me now. Bo Hines was in a Republican district, heavily Republican district, and he lost to a Democrat. And Ted Budd barely won. Candidates. I mean, the common denominator here is candidates. You can say it's Trump, and the left will say it's Trump. And to a degree, it was Donald Trump. Herschel Walker would not have run, but for Donald Trump. Bo Hines ran an entirely Trump race. Blake Masters was just not a good candidate in Arizona. Outside focus groups said he performed worse in focus groups than almost any candidate who ran, and in some surveys polled or surveyed worse than anyone ever. Herschel Walker did not poll well with Republicans in Georgia. Dr. Oz did not poll well with Republicans in Pennsylvania. What we suspected turns out to be right. Now, this is really important. You got to understand this, please. Pay attention to me. Some of you, those of you who are mad at me, listen to this. You've got to test your presumptions. And my presumptions had been after this election, I thought it was going to be a blowout for the Republicans, a banner year for the GOP. Everything suggested it should have been a banner year for the GOP. And when you looked at the turnout, the early vote turnout, when you looked at the day of turnout, who was turning out, Republicans clearly were voting at a higher proportion than Democrats in a lot of key states, which should have been a blowout for the GOP. But now we know those Republican voters voted Democrat or skipped the line in those races. So yes, the caliber of the candidate totally mattered. When you have key Republican voters, you can say they're moderates, you can say they're squishes, you can say they're rhinos. They regularly vote in Republican primaries, and they couldn't vote for their Republican candidate. That is not a problem for them. It's a problem that the party in the primary did not put up a candidate who could unite the whole party. This is a problem for the GOP moving forward, as well as some Republicans may choose to opt out, stay home, or vote Democrat in 2024. The candidate actually matters. The point of the primary process is to find a candidate who can build enough ground within the party to become the nominee of the party and hold that party in the general election. One of the things that happened here is that Donald Trump came out so aggressively endorsing certain candidates, it pushed them across the finish line in many cases, because Trump fans who waited for Donald Trump to tell him who he thought was good turned out in droves, helped that person, and that person alienated the rest of the party. And the best two examples of that nationwide are Herschel Walker in Georgia and Mehmet Oz in Pennsylvania. Mehmet Oz won by 0.1%. There is not a person in America who disputes the fact that he won because Donald Trump endorsed him, and he barely won even with Trump's endorsement. But he was the worst possible candidate to run against a man who can't put two sentences together due to a stroke. The voters of Pennsylvania, including a number of Republicans, voted for John Fetterman instead of Mehmet Oz. That's a damning indictment on Mehmet Oz as a candidate. Those voters had already voted for John Fetterman statewide as lieutenant governor. They knew him before the stroke. That's something a lot of outsiders forget. They knew John Fetterman before the stroke, and they preferred the man they knew to the outsider from New Jersey who couldn't pronounce the basic names of basic mom and pop shops in Pennsylvania. In Georgia, Republicans either skipped the line of the Senate race or voted for Raphael Warnock. In fact, the data shows that Republicans had a much higher propensity to vote in Georgia than Democrats, but a good portion of those Republicans refused to vote in the Senate race or voted for Raphael Warnock because they couldn't bring themselves to vote for Herschel Walker. You may love the guy, but a lot of people didn't, including a lot of Republicans. So Republicans in 2024 need to understand this. They actually did turn out. I have presumed, and this is something I'm wrong about, I had presumed that, yes, early voting was a real problem for the GOP. Turns out early voting was not a big problem for the GOP. My theory and the theory of other conservatives is that early voting had been a problem for the GOP, and the data that we have now shows it was not. Republicans in many key states, including Pennsylvania, Arizona, and Georgia, outperformed the Democrats. The problem was that those Republicans could not bring themselves to vote for the Republican candidates who were the nominees, and that's fixable. That's fixable. In fact, it's more easily fixable to some degree than trying to get an early voting model. The question, though, is can you get a candidate who doesn't alienate the Trump supporters while also not alienating the never Trump supporters who are all within the Republican Party? Well, in Florida, Ron DeSantis pulled it off. In Georgia, Brian Kemp was able to pull it off. In Wisconsin, Ron Johnson pulled it off. In Missouri, Eric Schmidt pulled it off. In Ohio, J.D. Vance pulled it off. In Ohio, Mike DeWine pulled it off. There are examples around the country should you choose to follow them and not believe your preferred myth. I was wrong about some of the data here, too. The data shows we don't have an early vote turnout problem for the GOP. We got a candidate quality problem. That is fixable.